Welcome. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Before we get to the meat of tonight's program, I just want to say a few words about upcoming events at the Council. As I'm sure that most of you are aware by now, we are in the midst of beginning to celebrate the Council's 70th anniversary. And we have recently confirmed the first in what will be a special anniversary signature series of programs. On Wednesday, December 5th, we will be partnering with St. Joseph's University to take a deep dive look at the vital and confounding relationship between the United States and Russia, program keynoted by former U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation, Michael McFaul. This speaker series, as well as other areas of growth in our programming that you all will be seeing, are being made possible by contributors to the Council's Rising to the Occasion anniversary campaign. Also coming up, a few more things this fall. We will be welcoming the astronaut Scott Kelly, the longest American resident of outer space, in a program in cooperation with the Franklin Institute. We will be next week holding a program on the midterm elections panel discussion in cooperation with our partner high school, the Bodine High School for International Affairs, and we have some students here from Bodine. Including, we will have at this program some young people who will be voting for the first time the week after next, and we're going to honor them for having registered and made the commitment to become voters. And then at the end of November, we have a panel discussion on the future of medicine in the 21st century, the future of medical technology and medical science in cooperation with Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. So lots before we break for the holidays, and we hope you'll be with us for those. On to tonight's program. Tonight, we welcome Robert Kagan, a noted historian and a leading American public intellectual, and, as you all know, the author of The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World. This book has been received as what I think it truly is, which is a very important statement about our time, and agree or disagree, something that everyone should really take a look at it. In the book, Mr. Kagan argues that while America First is the announced doctrine of our administration, a world in which the United States withdraws and tends only to itself is a dangerous world, perhaps the worst possible response in the face of global problems and disarray. I have read the book with keen interest, and I must say more than a bit of geekish fandom, which you'll see when I'm doing some questions with Mr. Kagan. Lots of questions that I'd like to pose, and I'm sure you have, so we will get to it. So please join me in welcoming Robert Kagan.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. I appreciate it, and thank you all for coming out and wanting to talk about foreign policy. I guess it's the World Affairs Council, so that's kind of your thing. But I do think that we are at one of those moments in American history when we need to have a great debate or a great discussion about foreign policy, because I think this is one of those times when Americans are not really sure about what the United States' role should be in the world. We've been operating, I think, on sort of strategic fumes ever since the end of the Cold War without much in the way of reassessment. And so instead of having a kind of open reassessment, we've had a series of elections in which I think foreign policy was an issue, but it was not an issue that was discussed in any great detail. And so I think we really do need to have that discussion, and I hope we're going to. I think if you look at the last election, you can see, and I think it wasn't new in the last election, but you can see the culmination of what has been an evolving skepticism on the part of, I would say, a majority of Americans about the role that the United States has been playing ever since the end of the Second World War. The enormous responsibilities that the United States has around the world, the enormous military that the United States has and has deployed around the world, the alliances the extensive alliances the United States has. I think ever since really the end of the Cold War, Americans have increasingly been asking the question, why? And it's a good question. And I think if you look at the four leading political figures of 2016, who were basically President Obama, the outgoing president, in the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and in the Republican Party, Donald Trump. If you think about the four of those, I would say three of them were basically arguing for a change in American foreign policy from what it had been, and only one was really arguing for anything like continuity, and that was Hillary Clinton. And I would say that she suffered for representing that continuity, and that those calling for change did better because they were suggesting that there should be change. So there's no question in my mind that Americans are seriously doubting the role the United States has played. And so this book is really an attempt to try to at least answer some of those questions or provide some answers, and it does so by going back in history. There's a fair portion of this relatively short book that is a kind of rehashing of some old history that I think Americans have forgotten, which answer the question at the very least, I would hope, how did we get to that role in the first place? Why did the United States ever adopt this role, which I think is a prerequisite to answering the question, is it still relevant to our time? You could decide that we had a role, but now it's no longer relevant. That's a reasonable argument. I don't agree with it, but it's a reasonable argument. But I do think it's worth remembering how we got there in the first place. And I think there are two sort of major misconceptions about what we call the liberal world order or the American-led order that was created after, well, really during and after World War II. One of those misconceptions is that the order was created and this American foreign policy was inaugurated in response to the Cold War, that it was a response to the Soviet Union and international communism. And that is actually incorrect. The basic outlines of America's role in the world, the decision to become and remain engaged in Europe and Asia after the war, the decision to create an economic order of a generally freer nature than it had been in the past, the decision to create what Dean Acheson called an environment of freedom in which America's own democracy could feel safe. That vision and those decisions were made before Americans thought the Soviet Union was going to be an adversary, and at a time when they really thought it was going to be an ally, as it was during World War II. It wasn't really until 1946 that people like Acheson and Marshall and Truman began to view the Soviet Union as an adversary. So it's important to remember that this vision for a world order that the United States would support preceded the Cold War, because that answers the question that I think a lot of Americans had after 1989, which is, well, the Cold War is over, so why do we still have this foreign policy? And I must say, even people like Jean Kirkpatrick were making this case. She wrote an article in 1990 saying, why can't America now return to being a normal nation again, now that the Soviet Union was gone and international communism was no longer the threat? So that's one misconception. The other misconception is that this liberal order is based on some kind of wonderfully idealistic vision of how terrific the world would be if only we pointed things in the right direction, that it was based on a kind of Wilsonian idealism and optimism about what could be done with humanity. And in fact, it is actually, the order was based on pessimism and fear about what humanity was capable of. The founders of this order, and again, I'm talking about people like Franklin Roosevelt during the war, Dean Acheson, Harry Truman, George Kennan, George Marshall, and all the people of that generation had lived through the most horrible period really in human history, or certainly that anybody could remember. The first 40 years of the 20th century, which saw 2 world wars the Holocaust, a famine, a sort of human-engineered famine that cost even many more lives than the Holocaust, that generation that lived through that first 40 years of the 20th century saw what human beings were capable of and the inhumanity that they were capable of. And the order that they built was not, as I say, based on optimism and idealism. It was based on pessimism about human nature and the need to contain and control the worst elements of human nature. And the system that they tried to set up, which blended both power, that was both economic and military power, and support for a certain kind of governance and a certain kind of international economic system, was designed as best as possible to try to contain forces of nature that they were convinced would always be with us. One of those forces of nature was in the international system, where the natural course of international affairs was toward chaos and conflict, not toward cooperation and convergence. And that was something that they saw in the first 40 years of the 20th century. If you wanted to say, where was history headed? Today we talk a lot about history unfolding and the arc of history bending in a certain direction toward justice. If you had asked anyone who had lived through those years, or asked them in 1939 which way history was headed, they would have said history was headed toward this catastrophe. And so they had a rather dark view of what was possible, and they attempted to contain and channel those dark forces, both in the international system and in terms of human nature, which they'd seen the worst elements of. And in this respect, by the way, they were very much like the founders of the American Republic, who also took a pessimistic rather than an optimistic view of human nature and attempted to establish structures and institutions that would acknowledge the baser instincts of human beings and attempt to contain them and steer them in the most beneficial possible direction. So that's all relevant to today, it seems to me. Getting rid of both of those misconceptions is important today. Because if you realize, if you accept the idea that both the nature of the international system and the nature of human beings is such that it tends toward conflict and chaos and potentially also toward tyranny rather than toward democracy and peace and prosperity, then you realize that the fact that the Soviet Union disappeared, the fact that we enjoyed 15 or 20 years of relative peace and prosperity and democracy does not mean that those things are fated to be. And in a certain sense, our order, the order that the United States created after World War II, was too successful for its own good, because it led people to believe that this relatively, in historical terms, prosperous, democratic, and peaceful period was simply a new normal, that we'd reached some kind of new plateau, that human beings had finally learned how to be better and how to behave better. And you see this in the writings of people like Frank Fukuyama with his famous essay on the end of history in 1989, which posited in a Hegelian sense that the better idea had won after a long struggle with other ideas. Liberal democracy had won. Today you can see it if you read the works of Steven Pinker, who has documented very carefully how much better humans are treating each other, even in their day-to-day activities, if you count things like the violence that humans commit against each other. But he attributes it to the final victory of Enlightenment ideals. I attribute it to the creation, including the use of power, to channel and contain the worst elements of international society and human nature and encourage the better angels. And my argument is that this will only continue so long as those who created that order continue to try to sustain it. And the metaphor at the heart of this book, the metaphor of the garden and the jungle, is sort of my way of trying to describe what I think our situation is. I'm not much of a gardener. I'm sure there are people out there who are gardeners, but I understand the principle of a garden. And the first thing to be said about a garden is that it is an artificial construct. It is something that humans create and cultivate. And the second thing to be said about a garden is that you don't plant your garden, walk away, fold your arms, and admire it, and assume that your garden will still be there a week later. Because there are natural forces at work, not evil forces, just natural forces that are always seeking to overwhelm and undermine a garden, the weeds and vines that are always growing back. So having planted your garden, you have to always spend all your time weeding and fighting back the jungle. And the order that we've been living in is very similar to that, in my view. And I'll just end on this note. You know, we can think of all the things that are wrong with the liberal world order that we've been living in since 1945. I could spend the rest of the evening listing the horrible things that have happened, the genocides, the wars that have continued, and also the inequality that's been created, the human beings' inhumanity to one another. All these things exist. We've not succeeded in creating a perfect world. But if you have any historical perspective at all, you have to see what an extraordinary period this has been nonetheless, and in three fundamental ways. One is in the prosperity that human beings have enjoyed. If you compare this to the entire sweep of human history in which there was no growth of economies, and also the 99.99% of all human beings lived in abject poverty throughout almost the entirety of human history, and only a tiny fraction of people ever enjoyed any well-being. Since the end of World War II, global GDP growth has averaged over 4% a year, even with recessions, and most of that growth has occurred especially in parts of the world that had known only poverty before, places like Asia and India and elsewhere. And during that period, 4 billion people have been lifted out of poverty, and we're now witnessing the largest middle class that humanity has ever seen. At the same time, we've seen an explosion of democracy unlike any other time in history. Democracy was the rarest form of government up until very recently, and today there are over 100 democracies in the world. That is unique. Most people throughout history have lived under some form of tyranny, and democracy, when it existed, was almost an accident. And finally, we've lived during this period in a time when there have been smaller wars, but we have escaped having to fight the kind of great power conflict that has had such cataclysmic effects both on the populations that fought them and on the rest of the world, the kind of great power wars we saw in World War I and World War II, and the Napoleonic Wars and the 30 Years' War, all of which decimated, really more than decimated, the populations of Europe and elsewhere. We've been spared that. Any single one of those qualities of a period would make this era unique. The fact that we've enjoyed all three makes it truly remarkable. But like a garden, we have to realize that this is an aberration. It's a historical aberration. It's not the norm. It is contrary to nature. It's something we created. And therefore, it is something that is fragile and will drift away from us so much faster than we think it will. People say, well, when do you anticipate the order collapsing? And I don't know the answer to that. If we were sitting here in 1925, we would look around the world and see a fairly democratic Germany, a democratic Japan, a new Treaty of Locarno, which was a kind of agreement between France and Germany, and which led to all kinds of hope for peace, and the American economy was roaring as it never had at any time in history, 1925. And so within 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, all that had completely collapsed, and we saw interventions of Japan and Manchuria, of Italy and Ethiopia, the rise of Nazi Germany, and I could go on, the whole story. I quote this line that I love from the Hemingway novel, The Sun Also Rises, Someone asks a guy who had gone bankrupt, how did you go bankrupt? And he says, gradually and then suddenly. And that's how orders fall. And so things may look relatively stable now, but it's astonishing how quickly things fall apart. And so, my plea is to understand how fragile this system is, to understand the difficulties of sustaining it, the burdens that we carry in sustaining it, which are financial and also in terms of lives lost, and also the moral burden of carrying it, because when you wield power, you inevitably act immorally. That's something that Reinhold Niebuhr taught us many years ago. But the choice is not between a wonderful world in which we don't have to do that and the choice and nothing. The choice is between doing that with all the costs and the much more serious crisis that we're likely to face if we don't. I've not talked about all the details because we're going to have an extensive Q&A, I hope, and we can talk about intervention, and we could talk about China and Russia and everything else. But I think it's vital that we have at least this big picture understanding of what's at stake. Good statesmanship will tell us what to do or what not to do, although we will also make mistakes. But we have to be guided. We have to have some kind of pole star to guide us as we go into the future, and that's what I'm trying to offer. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to our questions.
Thank you. You write in the book that the new authoritarianism rising around the world, most especially China and Russia, represent a renewal of the competition of ideas, a renewal of the sort of moral and intellectual argument about what the best system is, and also represent a renewal of geopolitical struggle, perhaps on a scale like the great power competitions that led to the wars. I think you're saying that in some ways this new threat can even be seen to be greater than what we faced during the time of the Soviet Union. Can you elaborate and explain?
Sure, and I think this is another example of the forces of nature just operating. I mean, we can look at what Russia and China are doing, the fact that they've returned to geopolitical competition, and a lot of times we say, well, what did we do to provoke this? And the answer is we didn't do anything to provoke it. They never stopped engaging in geopolitical competition. They just found themselves relatively weak after 1989, and as soon as they were able to get back on their feet, they resumed the geopolitical competition that they'd never ended. As far as sort of the present situation as opposed to the Cold War, we had this idea after the end of the Cold War that communism was the greatest threat we could possibly face, and so we were relieved only to be dealing with authoritarianism and autocracy. And so the one thing that you always heard, and even here today, is, well, we don't want to go back to something like the Cold War. I mean, whatever problems we're having with Russia and China, thank goodness it's not the Cold War. And I think if you look back on things now, I would say, Jimmy Carter spoke of having an inordinate fear of communism, and I think that there was reason to fear the Soviet Union, but we may have been too afraid of communism and not sufficiently afraid of traditional autocracy. And the reason I say that is because traditional autocracy, as we're seeing today, appeals to some very core aspects of human nature. Humans want the things that Frank Fukuyama talked about. They want recognition, they want a sense of freedom, they want to be granted their rights by government, but they also want other things. They want security, which can come from tribe and nation. They're actually willing to sacrifice freedom, sometimes for security or economic well-being, and sometimes they want a strong leader to tell them what to do. I wish this weren't the case, but that is what, so in a way, we're dealing with something that's very elemental when we're confronting these autocracies, and not something that's going to gradually fade away.
So I want to perhaps challenge a little bit some of the pessimism about the
Please.
fragility, right?
Please.
About the fragility of the order. So one can make an argument, I think, that that the retreat from the order, right, that people are saying exists in the current administration, exists on the level of rhetoric, what the president says, but not on the level of what the United States is actually doing, right? So we have deployed troops in the Baltics and in Poland. We have supplied lethal weapons to Ukraine. We continue freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea against the Chinese wishes. The president just mentioned the idea of withdrawing from the INF treaty on nuclear, intermediate nuclear forces because of both Chinese and Russian threats. So on a policy level, right, are we not doing the same things we would have done if Hillary Clinton had won? How would she have done it differently? And if that's the case, how much does the rhetorical level matter?
Right. It's a good question, and of course, I would also make a point that I think you're alluding to, which is that there is a lot of sort of durability to this structure that we created. This alliance system is very strong. It will take an awful lot to convince allies that we're not going to be there for them, but yet they can be convinced. And my concern is that, unfortunately, rhetoric matters. And what an American president says affects what nations see. So that on the one hand, yes, they're glad to see that we've added a couple of thousand troops in the Baltic states and in Eastern Europe, and that's a good thing. It was a holdover decision from the Obama administration. But then they also hear that Donald Trump saying that he doesn't understand why we would have to defend Montenegro, and everyone around the world hears something like that, and then they see an American president saying, treating allies on trade issues the same way he treats adversaries. So he regards Germany as an enemy on trade because they sell too many automobiles in the United States, and he's now turned his sights on Japan, and the Japanese thought they had a good arrangement with him, and Abe had played golf with him, and it was all going to be fine. The question is, at a certain point, since every nation in the world, the number one question they have, whether they're an adversary or an ally, is what is the United States going to do? I think the signal has been sent, and not just by Donald Trump, but by the American public and by even President Obama in his own way has raised real doubts about American staying power. And so whatever's happening today, they have to make adjustments looking to the future. And I'm concerned that if you look at Europe today and you look at Japan and Asia today, they are beginning to make those adjustments.
How much of your critique of the sort of the current trend in the United States with respect to the role of the United States in the world, how much of it depends on Donald Trump, on the election of Donald Trump? One can argue, right, that President Trump is president because a football stadium-sized number of people that had to be precisely distributed in 4 states gave him an unlikely electoral college victory. And that therefore, it does not represent a sort of profound change of course. How much of this, of your worry, is based on President Trump as an individual versus larger trends that you think go between the parties?
No, I'm more concerned about larger trends, and I don't think that the world changed, in January 2017. For one thing, I don't think Donald Trump could have been elected if the American people weren't at least agnostic about what he was saying about foreign policy. And I'm talking about a majority of Americans. And the mere fact that a majority of Americans either endorse the idea of America first or were agnostic about it is already a major development. And you can see these trends going back before Donald Trump. I think that President Obama was a liberal, and I think he would describe himself as a liberal internationalist, but he said we should be focusing on nation building at home, not abroad, which in my view is a softer version of America First. It's a nicer version, but even to suggest that we're doing one or the other is actually a false dichotomy, and it lends toward this idea that we're too engaged in the world. And I think Obama felt he was elected, and rightly so, felt that he was elected to retrench America's involvement in the world. And that is what the American people wanted. And I think that's why I raised, look at the campaign of 2016. Look where Bernie Sanders was on foreign policy, as well as Donald Trump and Barack Obama. And look what Hillary Clinton had to do in the course of her battle for the nomination. She had to renounce a trade agreement that was basically her signature trade agreement because it was so unpopular in the Democratic Party. So I think if you had had Hillary Clinton elected, the rhetoric would have been better. She would have said all the right things, but the trend in the country would still have continued. And I don't know that she could turn it around. And the reason I look at things this way is we're used to the American public sort of occasionally getting unhappy with the extent of our involvement, but then sort of bouncing back. I mean, we had Vietnam, and then they turned around and elected Ronald Reagan. But that's only one model of what Americans do. The other model of what Americans do is what they did after World War I, where they elected president after president after president who favored, I'll use isolationism just as code, but you know what I mean, favored a greatly restricted role for the United States. And then they elected Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Wilsonian internationalist. And what happened? He had to pretend that he was an isolationist too for his first 2 terms. So public opinion is powerful, and it doesn't turn on a dime. And I think we've been dealing with this trend in American public ever since the end of the Cold War.
So you don't buy the argument that basically what's happened is just that the parties have sort of switched sides, right? That the Democratic concern about interventionism and American overreach that came out of the Vietnam War has receded, that now the Democrats are acutely aware of a Russian threat, talking about it every day, whereas the Republicans have essentially, again, switched sides and gone from Reagan internationalism back to the 1920s approach. You think, essentially, in both parties, the retrenchment is now the dominant force?
I do, and I think that, yes, the opposition party is opposed to whatever the party in power is doing, but the question is, how deep is that opposition? And also, looking at particulars. So, yes, Democrats are upset with Russia for having given for potentially having given the election to the Republican president. But at the same time, they're promising, if they take control of the House, to cut defense spending and to reduce the number of troops overseas. And so you can't be tough with Russia while reducing our capabilities. And you certainly can't be tough with China while reducing our capabilities. I think the Democrats even more than Republicans, like Trump's trade war with China, but they are resistant to the idea of military spending to deter China. So, what the party that I see in the Democratic Party is the one that's moving toward what we used to call the left, but is now called progressive. And all my Democratic pals in Washington, part of that bipartisan foreign policy establishment, which Ben Rhodes called the blob, are feeling very lonely in their own party. And so I don't see anything like the kind of, I wish I were, but I don't see anything like the kind of reversal you're talking about.
So let's talk about what it would take for the United States to continue to lead the world order that you described in the face of new dangers. Should the United States fight World War III if China goes into Taiwan by force? Should we engage in conflict with Russia if Putin wants to take Estonia?
Well, World War III is a strong way of putting it. I mean, I think we can actually have, this is both good news and bad news. I think we can actually have a conventional war with China that does not turn into a nuclear war. Both sides are constantly planning for it. Now, that isn't to say that you start a conventional war and you don't slip into a nuclear war. That is a possibility. But I certainly would say both sides are planning on having a conventional war that doesn't go nuclear. But that having been said, we will have choices to make that are not different from the choices we had to make during the Cold War or the choices we had to make during the 1930s. We can decide that we are not going to do anything about China invading Taiwan or Russia invading Estonia. But if we do make that decision, we will be then inviting the complete breakdown of the international security situation. They would be, just as Japan's intervention in Manchuria and Hitler's seizure of the Sudetenland were just precursors to the next stage of expansion. That's also a natural force and a natural behavior of great powers. So too, that wouldn't be the end of Chinese expansionism. It would be the beginning of Chinese expansionism. It wouldn't be the end of Russia's desires. It would be the beginning of Russia's desires. Russia's sense, and not just Putin's, but Russian sense of what their natural position in the world should be, does not leave room for an independent Baltics, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. It does not leave room for an independent Ukraine. It does not leave room for an independent Georgia. It does not leave room for a Poland that is not under Russian control. That is the historic Russian sphere of influence. China's historic sphere of influence is no one in Asia has independent capacity to act, much less make alliances with a foreign power like the United States. China's natural sense of itself is that Japan is an insect that does what China wants it to do. And when we think about that, I think we should realize that the Japanese are not going to go quietly into a Chinese hegemony. So what you would see is the rearming of Japan on a much greater scale than they already are, including Japan could have several hundred nuclear weapons by next week if they wanted to, and that would be the world we would be moving into. You know, it isn't simply as, you know, when you read Peter Beinart's essay in The Atlantic, I don't know how many of you read it, there's sort of like this very smooth granting of China its sphere of influence. But that is not a smooth activity. That is an activity that leads to war. So I think that faced with those decisions, we have to resist a Chinese attack on Taiwan, and we have to resist a Russian attack on Estonia, because it would just be the beginning.
Do you see any path in which a leader could emerge in either party who shares your views and who would try to convince the American people of this approach?
I mean, not in the next election. I mean, it's very hard to predict what happens, you know, 2 or 3 presidential elections down the road. I don't think that anyone sitting around in 1974 would have predicted that Ronald Reagan would be president in 1980. So I don't want to get too, you know, I don't want to try to predict too far out. But what I would say is the notion of having a president who wants to lead the United States in an entirely different direction, I don't see any such candidate either who could possibly gain the nomination, but even more than that, who even exists, much less being able to gain the nomination.
So my last question is about the quote that you mentioned that President Obama cited often, attributed to Martin Luther King, actually from a pastor of the 19th century, but the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Are you such a pessimist that you don't believe in cultural evolution? You only believe in entropy?
I don't know if that makes me a pessimist. I think it just makes me a realist. I don't think that, you know, the great Enlightenment concept, which that really embodies more than Christianity, because my understanding of Christianity is you do get to the moment when everything is fine, but it's not like there's progression, right? And you know, most cultures don't have an idea of progress. The ancients had a cyclical sense that, you know, things rise and are built up, civilizations rise and then they collapse. I think the Chinese don't have an idea of progress. They think that their general view is that things are always what they are. Only we sort of in the West and you know, we children of the Enlightenment have this idea of of this idea of progress. And I think that it was based on making an equation between progress in scientific knowledge and technological development on the one hand, and moral development by humans on the other. And I think the thing that history has taught us as clearly as we could possibly want it to be taught to us is that you can have technological progress and scientific progress and even progress in terms of knowledge and understanding, but you don't get moral progress in humans out of that. So, and to me, it's astonishing to think that 80 years ago, we had all the things that were happening. You know, we had Hitler rampaging, we had Nazi Germany, we had the Holocaust, we had the famine of Ukraine, et cetera, all in the, all in the lifetimes of our parents and grandparents. And now suddenly it's all good. I mean, suddenly we've now reached some new level of progress. That's not what history tells us. I quote in the book some, big thinkers like Judith Sklar writing in 1950, or Hannah Arendt writing, also in 1950, saying it's ludicrous to talk about progress. How could you have lived what they had lived through and talk about progress? So I think that what there really is, and this is why I don't consider myself a pessimist, is that there's a struggle. It's a constant struggle between the good elements of human nature, the better angels, as Lincoln referred to them, and the baser elements of human nature. Human nature is, there's love and there's hate. There's selflessness and there's selfishness. There's desire for freedom and there's the desire for authority, et cetera, et cetera. And all these things are constantly in a battle with one another. And what I'm suggesting is that we not give up the battle because we assume that the good necessarily wins. Because I think we're learning right now that the good doesn't necessarily win. And so that's what I'm saying. I don't think that's a pessimistic view or an optimistic view.
Great note to end on. Okay, we're going to take some questions from the audience. Haley's going to bring the microphone.
Why do you call it liberal world order as opposed to world order? And what would not be a liberal world order?
It's a liberal world order because it bears the sort of elements of liberalism, which is to say, by the way, what I mean by the liberal world order, and I didn't, want to get into this in my opening remarks, but I'm glad you asked me. What I mean by the liberal order is the structure of fundamentally democratic alliances that was created after World War II and then expanded. And so it doesn't include Russia, it doesn't include China, but it does include today most of Europe and most of Asia and the United States and most of other parts of the world. It doesn't include the Middle East, or at least most of the Middle East. So within that liberal order, there are fundamentally liberal principles at work. Belief in democracy, belief in individual rights, which is a core liberal belief. It's not a universal belief. We'd like to claim that it's a universal belief, but it's not. There are people who don't believe in individual rights, and I think we're seeing, there are people who don't believe in the Enlightenment. There's a counter-Enlightenment out there as well. It's basically a system that believes in sort of free market capitalism as modified the way governments do modify it. And so that's the liberal order, and that's why it's liberal. You can have a world order that's not liberal, right? You can have the European world order of the early 19th century was not a liberal world order. In fact, it was dominated by autocracies, but it was a kind of world order. And so, there was a Roman world order, which wasn't liberal. But ours, because it's been shaped by a fundamentally liberal nation, which is what the United States is, a nation founded on Enlightenment principles, has reflected those principles.
Ted.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, with the country becoming more diverse, does a diversity, I guess, first protect us, and if not protect us, will it direct us into the future?
I'm sorry, diversity
of our country.
In our country.
Of the U.S. Will that protect us? If not protecting us, will it then in fact direct us into the future?
I see what you're saying. I don't think diversity protects us or directs us or doesn't protect us. I mean, the way I look at our situation is we have competing ideas of what nationalism means. And in my view, one is right and one is wrong, but nevertheless, they are competing. I'm not sure that, I don't know whether this is the question you're getting at, but I'll address it this way anyway. There is the nationalism that is uniquely American nationalism, which is the nationalism based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So it's nationalism based on universal ideals. And it's really, to my mind, it's what differentiates the United States from all other peoples in the world, because it's not what they would call a blood and soil nationalism. It doesn't matter where you were born. It's a nationalism based on universal principles. And that, I think, is the dominant idea of the nation that has guided the United States throughout our entire history. Competing with that has been what I think you would call white nationalism, or at one time you would have called white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nationalism. The founders were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but they didn't create, in my view, create a nation based on white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. But for the longest time, that was the majority, and many Americans did think that the country was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. The South insisted that American nationalism, the slaveholding South, was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nationalism. And we've had a recurring battle between one definition of nationalism and the other, and we thought it was, I think a lot of us thought it was over, but we've seen a resurgence of it today. So, you know, if you're the believer in the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nationalism, I think they now include Catholics for some reason, although they didn't before, they would say diversity is our problem, that diversity is divisive. And in fact, if you read even the last couple of books by Samuel Huntington, he was saying diversity was a weakness, and we needed to. And I almost think that Frank Fukuyama is suggesting that the founders should have designated a little bit more clearly what it meant to be, meant to be in America. But I haven't read his book carefully enough yet, so I don't want to make that claim. Anyway, so you could make that claim, but against that, I would argue that that's not what American nationalism is, and so diversity is our strength. So that's the answer.
Thank you. I just had a question regarding your viewpoint in terms of how it may be influenced, and maybe it's not, but how right now with an aging population, okay, where you have also a situation where you have an increasing amount of indebtedness. Those two principles right now and how that maybe affects your viewpoint.
Well, if what you're getting at is how can we afford the foreign policy that I'm talking about, I must say I really feel like one problem is about a massive expense that we are nowhere close to addressing how we're going to fund. And in fact, we seem to be addressing it by cutting taxes and increasing the national debt beyond what anyone could possibly have imagined. And so we're now talking about national debt and annual budget deficits that are mind-boggling compared to the budget deficits we used to be incredibly nervous about. As I recall, if you're old enough to remember the 1980s, it's almost laughable to think about the budget deficits that we were having a heart attack over then compared to what we have now. Our national security budget, however defined, if you add the defense budget to the foreign aid budget to even the homeland security budget, is a fraction of that amount. As any sort of budget analyst, all the budget reports that came out within the last few years, whether it was Alice Rivlin or Domenici or all these reports, none of them said our problem is national security spending. Our problem is clearly entitlements and fiscal policies that are driving our budget deficit through the roof. So when people say, how can we afford to have the foreign policy you're talking about, I want to say, Congress farts that amount of money every day. And you don't even, I'm sorry, I know this, it's a technical foreign policy, it's an international relations theory term, and you don't think twice about it. But when it's about foreign policy, we say, well, how come we're spending so much money? And I think that at the root of that is this idea that I think Americans have always had, that foreign policy is an option. You know, we live behind these two oceans, we're basically safe, so anything we spend on it is kind of optional. And that's why we just count all the money we spend on defense and foreign aid, et cetera, as just a net, that's just money down the drain. As opposed to understanding that that money is actually insurance. It's an insurance policy against much greater expenses down the road if we don't have that insurance policy. You can drive your car without an insurance policy. As long as you don't get into an accident, you saved a lot of money. But the minute you get into an accident, you're bankrupt. And that's kind of the way we should be looking at foreign aid and defense spending, that it's an insurance policy. But instead, we say, well, that's just money down the drain. Whereas farm subsidies, we're all that's fine, you know.
Next. Go ahead.
So, in your world theory, I think some of us wonder how our government is functioning. I mean, when Congress doesn't really discuss or debate these issues, and when we hear that our State Department is depleted and we don't have diplomats doing the kind of work behind the scenes that may be necessary, does that play a role in your view?
Well, as someone who's spent 90% of my time studying American history and basically the history of American foreign policy, I don't want to sit up here and tell you that there was a time when we used to just do it brilliantly and rationally, and Congress wasn't sort of a silly place, and we had incredibly professional diplomats at all times. I mean, there was a window, I would say, from basically World War II when we had to get incredibly serious about all this stuff, and then for maybe a couple of decades afterwards, maybe 3 decades after World War II, when we probably had a higher level of government seriousness about these matters. And by the way, they made mistakes too, right? It was those very serious people that got into Vietnam and the Korean War and all those other, so it's not even that you can have a guarantee of intelligent policy even when you have intelligent people running it. So, but having said that, we've taken on a massive role as a world power. We can't have a depleted State Department now. We can't have a government bureaucracy that's as chaotic and subject to the whims of a single individual as we have now. We can't have a situation where a Secretary of State thinks he's leaving for North Korea that day only to discover in a tweet that he isn't leaving. You know, this is a problem, and it is having an effect on the way the world views the United States as we're unpredictable enough as it is. America is a very hard country to read, actually. But to add to that unpredictability with this kind of situation, I do think it's about the worst it's ever been right now. But I think that's reflected, that's the consequence of the particular personality of the person in the White House and that person's attention span and that person's motives in foreign policy. So therefore I have 2 things to say. One is that it was never that great, but now it's really bad.
Well,
Hi, Paul Shattuck from Drexel University. Thank you for a really terrific talk. Really enjoyed that. Looking forward to reading the book and buying some copies for people on my holiday wish list. Can I get it on Amazon?
Well, you're gonna make a lot of friends on the holiday wish list.
I know. I can feel the love already. So if I understand the analogy of the garden, these are structures and policies and practices that were put in place towards the end of World War II and thereafter to sustain positive relations and keep in check our worst angels, right? So that was a world that was dominated by nation states. So one of the things that's happened since then is the evolution or emergence of non-state actors. And it's a respectful question. I'm basically in sync with your argument. I think you've got great points. But I'm wondering, is it a little bit too statist? And what is the role in your scheme? Like, where do, say, multinational corporations, many of which have no fealty to a particular country other than their own bottom line, and global financial markets and banks. So look at the last global recession. where it was really triggered by financial institutions that have more assets in play than most nations. And or entities like that are not state actors. They can one day be a beautiful flower in the garden that provides bounty for all, and the next day they can be a noxious weed that brings down the global economy. All right, and so where do they fit? And then we have non-state actors like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who are borderless entities that nonetheless wield tremendous power. So where do non-state actors, both of the for-profit kind and the nefarious kind, sort of fit in your scheme?
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's a very good question. It's a very reasonable question. And I will plead guilty to having a statist prejudice. And because, you know, the argument that the nation state was fading away and being overtaken by transnational institutions and non-state actors is a pretty old one. And I mean, Jessica Matthews wrote a famous article in Foreign Affairs in 1995, I believe, called Power Shift, which was about that. And so I've been answering this question now for almost 25 years. And I have to say I'm actually struck by how little power states have actually ceded and how much power states have actually accumulated for themselves. And I would go, you know, on a number of fronts. But one of the reasons that my prejudice is for statists is that I still want to address the question of what sustains the world order. So ISIS is a terrible threat and can kill, you know, thousands of people, and maybe with the right weapons even more than thousands of people. But I don't think ISIS can upset the world order. I think only nations can upset the world order, and in fairly traditional ways. And if you look at the international system, one of the things that we used to believe, or many argued, was sort of the Tom Friedman, the world is flat argument, and that really was pinning a great deal of emphasis on the internet and the free flow of information, which was supposed to overwhelm states, and I think the idea was, and lead to greater freedom because states wouldn't be able to control it. So what are we seeing today? We're seeing states taking the internet and using it as a tool of control. And in fact, China now is able to use all this new communications technology to create this social index and to keep track, and they're going to have facial recognition. And so just as in the past, you know, Orwell's nightmare of 1984 made use of these technologies. So we've already seen that didn't undermine the power of the state. And the interesting thing about the financial crisis, that although it was certainly caused by financial institutions that were, in a sense, under-regulated by governments, the financial crisis was contained, and I think quite effectively compared to the past, by the cooperation of governments and the cooperation of treasuries and central bankers and others who sort of work together to try to contain it. So I'm not persuaded that the balance has actually shifted against the state. If anything, I would say the balance seems to have shifted back in favor of the state. So, but we could continue that discussion, but I'm not unaware of what you're saying. I'm not seeing it the way we kind of expected.
We've reached 7 o'clock. We'll take, I got 2 hands up. Okay, we'll take these 2 and then we'll be done.
Sorry, it's my fault for the long
No.
answers.
Just wondering, this is kind of a theory, you can tell me I'm wrong, but it's sort of, I think that what's happening now is that there's sort of positions being thrown out there without any scientific basis. The tax cut there was no Treasury report that was able to qualify the tax cut to do what it was going to do. So what I think is happening is that there's a lot of things that are happening, but they're not supported by any scientific study. They're just sort of, let's just make this happen because we want it to happen. So where you can have a president that can say anything and people believe it because there's just a lack of critical thinking, a lack of what if he's wrong? It's sort of like people are buying into whatever they want to have happen in their lives to make their lives better, even though it might not work out, just because they think, like a Pied Piper or something, that there's a lack of science, critical thinking. That's my question.
Well, you know, I don't know that that's a unique phenomenon in this era. I think that, you know, I could think of a lot of occasions when really faulty economic policies were extremely popular. I think about the tariff policies of the certainly the 1880s and 90s, but then again in the 1920s, people were passing tariff bills that turned out to be absolutely catastrophic for the American economy and the global economy, but they were incredibly popular. And so I think to some extent what you're describing are flaws in human nature and unfortunately flaws in democracy that accentuate those flaws in human nature. I think if you say, what is our problem with spending? Our problem is that we want everything. We want our entitlements, we want our tax cuts, we want all the things that government can possibly give us, and honestly, we are willing to let someone else pay for them if at all possible. And that is not what you call responsible behavior, but I'm not actually, I would like to see some evidence that our democratic system is capable of reining in that tendency. There is an argument to be made that it is not. And so we will see. So of course, it's not based on science. It's based on we want. And so it'll be an interesting test. And usually, by the way, it takes some massive catastrophe to turn things in a different direction. And we had a financial crisis, which I think led to conservative behavior by individuals, which lasted about, 8 years? And now we're over it. And so I'm not an economist, and I'm certainly not a scientific person, but I notice, it seems to me, that you have an economic calamity about once every 40 years, which I'm sure has something to do with human psychology. You have the calamity, people tighten their belts. My father is a Depression-era guy who still doesn't want to put his money in the market because he doesn't believe in it. But other people get over it and they forget, and then you go through the whole cycle. I wish I felt that there was an obvious way out of that.
Thank you. First, thank you very much for coming here. Now my question, please. Based upon my reading of the electronic newspapers, my impression is that we have a millennial generation of white, educated, college-educated people who utterly despise their race, who reject Western culture in general and the U.S. in particular. Assimilation with immigrants is racism. Patriotism is racism. You see that in colleges. You see that in Google and probably elsewhere in high-tech land. Number one, do they represent the large fraction of the population that I would get the impression from by reading the serious newspapers? I'm not talking about Breitbart here. And furthermore, how can a generation of people like that, when they become your age, possibly run a serious world power?
I love when you said electronic newspapers. It sounds like when people would say the Iron Horse, but I have 2 college-age children. One of them just graduated, and one of them who is a junior. So I have I've been sort of watching them go through this, and I wouldn't endorse every one of your characterizations, but I do think there is a lot of confusion out there. I don't know that they're getting quite the same education in the same way that older generations did. They're getting taught a lot of skepticism. Now, some of that skepticism is good, and some of it is excessive. But here's what I would say, and what I think I'm already seeing. But this is like so anecdotal. You mentioned science. This is the opposite of science. This is personal experience that I'm seeing. And I think it fits, though, with a pattern. In college, a lot of things seem true that the minute you get out there into the actual world of work and life begin to seem less true. And I think a lot of these young people who've gone through this educational system are coming out the other end, by the way, and are seeing what's happening in their political system and are now searching for something to hold on to again. As I say, I wouldn't characterize everything the way you did, but what I would say is I think a lot of young people today were not taught and do not know where to stand. if you're going to make a judgment about something, what moral principle are you basing that judgment on? The relativism that Alan Bloom warned of, I think, is rampant. But you can't actually live a relativistic life that way. You ultimately have to start making choices. So I think, if you had said, how is the generation, I'm sure if we were sitting here in 1968, and we had the pot smoking, free love, anti-war, anti-system, et cetera, all that good big chill stuff, we would say, how are those people going to run the country? Now you might say, we've seen how they run the country and it's a disaster. So I may have just completely undermined my whole argument. But I actually think that, those are not the same. The people who were in college in 1968 were not the same people when they were in government or whatever 30 years later, or in politics or in the business world or whatever. And so we have to let youth do its thing. Now, that's the most optimistic thing I've said all night.
It is.
And
It is.
so
It's
I'm going to
perfect
leave
ending.
it right there.
Yes. Thank you.